Can you really trust the VO2 max that your Garmin watch is giving you? To answer this question, I'm gonna take a comment from somebody from the community, Camille, who's been following many of the Upside Strength programs over the last couple years, and who asks that he has a question on VO2 max. So this comment is in French. I'm going to translate it in English for you. He has a question on VO2 max, even though he knows that values that the watch displays are estimations. He said that when he followed the Power 2.0 program, which is a bike high intensity training program with what we call a polarized distribution, meaning mainly high intensity and low intensity efforts on the bike. He said his VO2 max went up to 50. Here, 50 is the relative VO2 max, meaning expressed relative to his body weight. So 50 is 50 milliliters per kilo per minute. This is how much how much oxygen his body is able to consume. And then he said that since he started up with the Endure program again, which is my other bike program and which is more of a pyramidal distribution, meaning mainly low and medium intensity rather than high intensity training, he said that his watch is now giving him 44 milliliters per kilo per minute. So his essentially his VO2 max went down significantly by switching programs. He said that is that really a thing? Can VO2 max drop that much between programs, or is it the stimulus that you impose to the watch that's going to fluctuate? That's going to make the result fluctuate at a given point in time. So to answer this question, we need to first understand how Garmin calculates that VO2 max. And before I go into this, a question that comes up a lot is that value accurate? And I do physiological testing. So I put people on a bike, I put the mask on them to measure VO2, to measure oxygen consumption, and we take lactate and we do some other things so that we can really understand how the body works and the profile of the person at that point in time. And I can tell you that over the last couple of years, when I've had people come to me with their Garmin watch saying my VO2 max is, let's take 50 for Camille's example, and I test them on the bike, usually the VO2 max I measure is pretty close. I'd say it's usually within 7% of their actual VO2 max. So I would say it's pretty accurate most of the time when it comes to this. But now in this case, why would his VO2 max drop just because he changed training programs? He didn't just stop training. He just switched the way that he was training. He was doing more high intensity before. Now he's doing more medium intensity. And so why is that? We need to understand how Garmin calculates his VO2 max, estimates his VO2 max. And what I understand at this point in time is that Garmin takes your heart rate during training, and with the algorithms that they've developed and with the massive data sets that they've accumulated over time, thanks to all the users of the technology, they're able to estimate based on heart rate what the VO2 max of the person is. They'll usually also take power output if it's available. They'll take pace or speed if somebody's running. And they'll put all that together, and then they'll determine what the person's VO2 max is. And the reason why Camille's VO2 max seemingly dropped when he switched programs is probably because when he was doing the high intensity program, the high intensity sessions obviously made his heart rate go up quite a bit. But now that he's doing more medium intensity, so tempo zone 3 or threshold zone 4 sessions, what's happening is that on average, his heart rate, even in the more intense sessions, is just not as high as it was during the high intensity program. And so Garmin is reading this as, oh, your fitness went down because now your sessions are just not as hard as before. Your heart rate just doesn't go as high as it did before. But that isn't true, meaning that if he were to put back a couple high intensity sessions in his training, you would probably see that VO2 max go up pretty quickly again because he's reaching those higher heart rates again, which he isn't doing very consistently now that he's a few weeks into the medium intensity program. So I wouldn't worry about this, Camille. Your heart rate or your heart rate isn't going super high right now, which is fine because we're working more on durability. We're working on longer sessions rather than more intense sessions. And this is going to increase your fitness. It is going to increase your VO2 max ultimately. But you'll have to go back to the higher intensity sessions to get an accurate reading on your watch because you need that higher heart rate for it to estimate what is going on with your VO2 max. So this is not an issue. Don't worry too much about your VO2 max dropping on your watch, especially if you're doing a medium intensity program or if you're doing, for example, if somebody does low intensity for a month or two, so pretty low heart rates continuously and really very little high or medium intensity, you might actually see VO2 max go down even further because of what I just cited before. So only consider that VO2 max not accurate, but reliable when you're doing high intensity sessions, when your heart rate is going up pretty high, so that the algorithm actually has all the information to make their estimations. And since we're on the topic of Garmin, I got another question from the community, Thierry, who asks, he sees that on his Garmin watch, there's a zone that is called higher aerobic, and he tested a zone 3 session and a zone 4 session, and he says it doesn't actually work on the higher aerobic intensity that the watch is giving him. He said that maybe higher aerobic intensity doesn't actually exist. So the way I understand this is that higher aerobic work for me would be tempo type training, so zone 3, a little bit above the first physiological threshold. And the thing to understand with the watches, now we've talked about VO2 max, but if we want to talk about zones related to your Garmin watch, what you need to understand is that typically Garmin takes population averages to determine your heart rate ranges for the different zones, and you are not the average. I've seen huge variations from person to person at a given intensity, physiological intensity. Like I said before, we did a physiological test. We can measure lactate, measure all these parameters, determine zones based on that person's physiology at that moment in time. And the zones that Garmin was giving them could be 15 or 20 beats off, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, because again, everybody is different. And even you at one point in time, your heart rates in different zones is going to change as you become fitter, right? Or as you detrain, if you have a detraining effect because you had to stop, you had an injury or something like that, your zones will change. So you cannot rely on these heart rate zones that your watch gives you. So what I would recommend if you want to do higher aerobic work or zone 2 or tempo training, which typically on a bike might be 3 times 10 to 20 minutes, 2 or 3 times 10 to 20 minutes of continuous work, I would use RPE. I would use your perceived effort. And for me, that remains the most important metric in training, especially when we're doing endurance work. Even when we do strength work, you can use the reps in reserve, which is derivative of RPE technically. But RPE is a great way to calibrate your training intensity. And for a tempo session, I typically aim for 4 to 5 out of 10, sometimes up to 6 out of 10 if the session is longer. But really, we don't want to go any higher than this for some higher aerobic work. If you're going into threshold training, then we're closer to 6 to 7. And then as soon as we go into zone 5, high intensity, we go into the 8s and above. But really, unless you're doing a really, really long medium intensity or tempo session, I wouldn't go beyond 5 or 6 because you really want to keep that session fairly easy, right? It's more of a long session than a hard session, and that's really something that's important to understand when you train endurance. Is that for the high intensity you want to intensify, for the medium intensity you want to extensify. So you'd rather have longer sessions with the tempo and the threshold training, whereas with the VO2 max you probably can push the watts or push the pace a little bit, and that will give you good results. So here you go. I hope I was able to bring some answers around the Garmin watch, around the VO2 max, around the zones. If you have any follow-up questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.